So I have something prepared this morning in Jude, staying in our series. But I was thinking this week also and reading up a little bit on the situation in Ukraine. And sometimes I think it's good to think about current events as well. So I was going to kind of give us a choice, I guess. Either do this or to kind of talk about what's going on in the Ukraine and maybe how that possibly fits with prophecy. But I don't know if any of you have looked at that at all. Any thoughts? What would you rather do?
We do both.
Both?
Yeah.
I don't know if I have that much time. Well, we could.
On the way here, Louis did ask, what's going on over there?
Okay. Well,
So we did our best.
yeah, let's talk a little bit about it. So where I think I would start would be in a little bit about what the different views of end times are, because that kind of has a lot to do with how we look at the end times. So I'll just go down over the 4 different views, and there may actually be 5. But there's a preterist view, and they say that John is writing to encourage the Christians in his own day who are experiencing persecution from the Roman Empire. And so the challenge from that is to gain the same kind of encouragement that John's first readers gained from the vivid images of God's sovereignty. But kind of the caution with that one is that we don't want to forget that most biblical prophecy has both an immediate and a future application. The view that I kind of grew up with, didn't really grow up with it, but it was presented to me in college, was the idealist view. And that is that the book of Revelation and the end times event is a symbolic representation of a continual struggle of good and evil. So that view believes that it doesn't really refer to any particular historical event, but it is applicable at any point in history, because it's this good and evil that we always struggle with. And then there's the futurist view, and they say except for the first 3 chapters of Revelations, John is describing events that will occur at the end of history. And so they would tend to see contemporary events, that many of those would have the characteristics that John describes and realizes that the end could come at any time. And then there's a historical view of the book of Revelations, that it's a presentation of history from John's day until the second coming of Christ. So there's always these views, and then within them you have the post-tribulation, pre-tribulation, that the rapture is going to happen before the tribulation, or will it happen after the tribulation? And I always tell people I'm a pan-millennialist, because it's going to pan out in the end. So that's kind of my view. I had a friend that was he was a pastor, and he went to this big conference on end times. And he said he was just new in the ministry, and So he was like really seeking God, like he should have a theology about end times. So he went to this conference and he said, everybody presented their views and nobody moved on their views, and everybody went home believing what they believed. And so he said, I went home and I really asked God, I seeked God, and I said, God, what? And he said, God just told me to tell my people to be ready. And I think that is the biggest takeaway from Revelations and the end times. Each of these approaches has capable supporters and support. None of them have proven to be the only way to read Revelations and to look at end times. So I think the basic application and the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, how reading Revelations, looking at times, how is that going to help me become a better follower of Jesus? It's really the question, I think. So, but as I've been thinking about the Ukraine situation, and I don't know if you want Bibles, Bob, if you want a Bible, maybe raise your hand, because we're kind of in this Ezekiel 37. Gotta find it. So I was doing a little reading on what people think about what's happening in Ukraine and the move of Russia to take over the Ukraine. And if you go to chapter 38, I don't know if I want to read this whole thing, but let me kind of just go down through it. So this is another message that came to me from the Lord. Son of man, turn and face Gog of the land of Magog, the prince who rules over the nations of Meshi and Tubal, and prophesy against them. I'm gonna mess up these names, but I'll do the best I can. Give him the message from the sovereign Lord. Gog, I am your enemy. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws to lead you out with your whole army, your horses and charioteers, in full armor and great horde, armed with shields and swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya will join you too, with all their weapons. Gomer and all of its armies will also join you, along with the armies of Beth-Togem from the distant north and many others. Get ready, be prepared. Keep all the armies around you mobilized and take command of them. A long time from now, you will be called into action. So I think that kind of struck me. A long time from now, you will be called into action. So kind of a prophesying for the future. In the distant future, you will sweep down on the land of, I lost my place. You will swoop down on the land of Israel, which will be enjoying peace after recovering from war, and after its people have returned from many lands to the mountains of Israel. You and your allies, a vast and awesome army, will roll down on them like a storm and cover the land like a cloud. This is what the sovereign Lord says. At that time, evil thoughts will come to your mind, and you will devise a wicked scheme. You will say, Israel is an unprotected land filled with unwalled villages. I will march against her and destroy these people who have lived in such confidence. I will go to those formerly desolated cities that are now filled with people who have returned from exile in many nations. I will capture vast amounts of plunder, for the people are rich with livestock and other possessions now. They think the whole world revolves around them. But Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish will ask, do you really think the armies you have gathered can rob them of silver and gold? Do you think you can drive away their livestock and seize their gods and carry off plunder? Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy against Gog. Give him the message from the sovereign Lord. When my people are living in peace in their land, then you will rouse yourself. You will come from your homeland in the distant north with your vast cavalry and your mighty army, and you will attack my people Israel, covering their land like a cloud. At that time, in the distant future, I will bring you against my land as everyone watches, and my holiness will be displayed by what happens to you and Gog. Then all the nations will know that I am the Lord. Then he goes on to say that his anger will boil over, and that the mountains will fall, they'll be thrown down, the cliffs will crumble. He will summon the sword against you on all the hills of Israel. I will punish you and your armies with disease and bloodshed. I will send torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. In this way, I still know my greatness and I will show my greatness and holiness. And then chapter 39, I'm going to read it obviously, but it goes on to talk about how God destroys the hordes of Gog. And so I was kind of reading up on this a little bit, and I want to just say that I have no idea. You know, I don't know much about prophecy and stuff, but from what I was reading, that Gog is probably a leader. He's probably a leader or a kind of a leader of an alliance that is formed, and some of the thought is that is Russia, and then a lot of the Middle Eastern countries that join with Russia, and possibly even China, that are going to come against Israel. So the first thing in verse 31, Ezekiel shows that the people of Israel will again be restored to a nation. And it seems to me like that's already happened. They have a nation, they've come back to their own homeland. But Israel's actually a pretty strong nation now. And so it would seem like there's this confederacy of nations that's going to come and attack. And you can also see that in Revelations 20:18 or 28. Just go there.
There's not 20. Oh, 20.
28. 20 verse 8.
There's not 20.
Right, sorry. This is about the defeat of Satan. He will go out to deceive the nations, called Gog and Magog. In every corner of the earth he will gather them together for battle. A mighty army as numberless as sands along the seashore. And I saw them as they went up on a broad plain of the earth and surrounded God's people and the beloved city. But fire from heaven came down on the attacking armies and consumed them. Some people think that scripture has nothing to do with Ezekiel. I don't know, but it could, I think. So it's just interesting to me that this process that Russia has now is invading Ukraine. And so part of me thinks, and just with the whole thing with COVID and everything that's going on in our world, and just looking now at Russia invading Ukraine, there's just this kind of sense in my heart that the time is short. And maybe it's going to be 200 years from now. I don't know. But to God, that's a short time. And so I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you have any thoughts? It's kind of a time for discussion. And have you had any thoughts in your own prayers about what's happening? And we had a really sad thing happen. A friend of ours who's a missionary within faith, just as a pastor like I am, somebody I really connected with, just a very gentle, godly man, contacted COVID. And we heard, well, he's out of the hospital, he's doing well. And the next thing we heard that he had died, and from complications of COVID. And so Glenda was watching the funeral this morning, Streamline, and what had actually happened was he had gotten a dementia from COVID. And the dementia,
Paranoid.
he had this paranoia that came with it, and he had actually shot himself. And, when I look at that, and I look at what's going on in the world, to me there's something bigger. And I just sense God saying, you better get your house in order. You better get your house in order. And that's kind of, I don't really know if Russia invading Ukraine has anything to do. Will that continue? Will they continue to take over all the countries, and will they eventually some of the people that really study end times say that eventually there'll be a big road built from China and Russia down to Israel. And I looked at the map, and Israel is not very far from Russia. I mean, it is not far at all. And we already know that a lot of the Middle East countries are in with Russia, like Iran, some of them. So is this the beginning of something, And so, although I kind of don't see or view end times in that kind of that view of, that Revelations has an exact timeline and everything. At the same time, I think there's a very good possibility that there's a dual meaning, and that we are beginning to see the start of of something that's gonna eventually show us that, yeah, we're in the end times, you know. Interesting thing is that, you know, the disciples thought they were in the end times too, you know, but I mean, I think we know we're in the end times, you know. I think since Jesus came and died and rose again, we've been in the end times. But I think it's very possible it's closer, you know. So that was kind of really my heart, was just to say, and it made me think about my own life. And, you know, am I living right? Am I living solidly as a follower of Jesus? Am I ready? You know, am I ready when that trumpet sounds, or however it's going to happen, you know? And there's a part of me that wonders, I've known so many godly people that have died of COVID and went home to be with Jesus, and there's a part of me that wonders if there's something coming, that God is being gracious to them by taking them home. You know, I don't know. But, you know, years ago when my mom was killed in a car accident, I told Dad that. I said, you know, it's kind of a thing where I'm rejoicing, because God knows what's ahead for us, and sometimes I think He does those things too. So, any thoughts? I've talked and I've kind of rambled on and on, but
I mean, just my own personal guardrails and boundaries around these sorts of things, and how to process what's going on in the world is there will be wars and rumors of wars. Like, that's one. We are not to fear sudden disaster. And also that whenever we read the Bible, especially in times, you have to take the whole Bible, as in, God is so big, He's so good, and He wants to warn us of what's ahead, not to worry, but to prepare us, so that when we see major things going on, we say, there's a good end here. We get to go to see Jesus eventually, and so we don't ever need to panic. But we always need to remember, we have to be on the side of Israel. No matter what side you're on, make sure you're on the right side of Israel. Bless the nation of Israel, and you can be sure to be on God's side. So those are kind of my guardrails for whenever I think about end times, whenever I see a war coming. I mean, we always pray, and we're always asked to pray for peace and love people individually, and those are some of my parts. That gives me peace when I look at COVID, when I look at people dying, when I think of wars. Those things give me peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Leah.
When I did all my research for the book I wrote, it's just like you, there's a lot of views. But the overall one was that our world would become global. And because of the technology that we have now, our world is able to communicate globally and can mandate globally and all of that. And it even mentions how Satan is waiting for that global unity. And when that global unity happens, then he can act, because he can take over that power. But the book of Revelation, from what I understand from my research, is not this, then this, then this. It is all encompassed, and it's all intertwined with the Old and the New Testament. And the message always given when I was researching that was not to pay attention necessarily to each of the events, but to understand where God is working in each of those events, so that we're not being deceived by the enemy in thinking that this is it. So then the one other thing I wanted to say was that as far as Israel goes, the people of Israel are scattered all over the world. And yes, I do believe that the end times are going to take place in and around the country of Israel, but the people of Israel are God's focus, I guess. That's what I found when I was researching. And it's his intention to gather those people. Now, however that looks, whether it be into that country or just gather in spirit, then the final battles will begin. That's just my research. My personal opinion is this is the beginning of end times. This is it. And that we're not to focus on what's happening, but on God.
Yeah, I think
And
that's,
on following
yeah.
and putting our heart into everything God related.
I think that's a good word. And that's well said.
And if you haven't read my book,
I read it.
just saying,
I read it.
there's just saying, it's a story, but
Right.
there are some
It's good.
messages.
Something that I've seen on social media just a little bit recently is people's response to, like, when they get a phone camera shoved in their face or certain things, not even shoved in their face, but in the videos that I've seen recently, it's like people will be like, "Hey, mate, how's it going, my friend?" And people's response is, "I'm not your friend. I'm not your mate." And I'm like, where's this attitude coming from that now we can't even talk to strangers and say friend? Because no, that's not, I don't know you like that, I don't trust you. You can't even call me a friend. And then there's this hostility that's started to come from just everyday conversation and appearance. And when we're walking down the aisle with our grocery carts and nobody can use "excuse me, please," certain things like that, like our simple everyday kindness is leaving us in our vocabulary and our ways of communication. And so something that's been impressive on me is like, if there's nothing, social media is showing us all the negative. It's our blessing to be able to double down on kindness and to show the world that that's not, that's not the only thing that's here. That there are Christians, there are people that still believe in the beautiful world that God has created. And it's not just all negativity, but that's how it is in our vocabulary, which is where it starts with everything. That's just something that I've seen recently in social media, that people won't even call each other friends. It's become an interesting demeanor that I've seen taking place.
I think there's verses, I wish I knew where they were. Somebody knows them or wants to Google them, but there's verses that kind of talk to that fact that in the last days, people will hate each other, family will turn against family will turn against family, there will be hostilities, I kind of think that's a thing of end times too. Because you're right, you're almost afraid to look at somebody in the grocery store. Anymore, I think that's a really good point. And really, we have a crisis, a wreck.
When trains are turning loose.
Yeah.
They're training.
So really, that is, I think, the gist is that we need to continue to love and show Christ to people, there has to be a lot of fear out there in people's hearts about what's going on, and for us to be able to say kind of what Eileen said, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, you gotta remember, like she said, look at the end of the book, we win. And not to be worried about it. Go about your business and love those people, because that's the only way they're gonna have a relationship so that you can lead them to show them the way where they need to go.
Yeah.
So you just gotta maintain, we win. Because otherwise it's overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of overwhelming's kind of word that I felt over the last 2 years, you know, just kind of overwhelming sometimes what's going on. But I love, like, in Amazing Grace, verse 3, the Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. So, you know, it's, and I think we need to pray for those people in Ukraine. I mean, I've read a little bit about the government of Ukraine. There's people that say it's a really corrupt government, but my heart's for the people of Ukraine, you know, that are, you know, there's a lot of good Christians there, and our brothers and sisters, and so I think it's really important to pray for them as well. So, I think that's all I have, really. I did. Let's go ahead and pass this around. Any other thoughts or things that you guys have been? Louis or Bob? Louis or Bob, any thoughts?
Oh, come on, you wise old man.
Yeah, you're a day older. You gotta have something really wise to say.
I have 3 months where I can just, poor guy, get in his ice pack.
That's great.
I have some prayer requests.
Yeah.
You got some time?